Hi there. Welcome to the Writer's Desk, the podcast for the Inheritance Gambit. I'm Serenity, and thank you so much for joining me for the next little while we talk about our thoughts and ideas for how and why we put our game together. G'day, and welcome to the Writer's Desk. This is Serenity, and with me today I have Reliant.
Hello.
And I have Galactica.
Hey.
Now that's a big thing. We've managed to tempt Galactica out of her little hole to come and say hello to us. Now today we're going to talk about why we chose Fate for our game, the Inheritance Gambit, and a little bit about the tech that exists within the game. So I'm going to let Reliance start. Why did we go with Fate?
That's a question that probably a few people have asked because Fate is not especially well regarded in viewing circles, or at least not the kind of viewing circles that regularly talk about the kinds of things they like. There are a few reasons, which we can probably sort of break down by just considering the question, why didn't you do X instead? So why didn't we do pure traits instead?
That's actually a really good question.
One of the problems with pure traits games is, well, there's two problems with pure traits games. The first one is that they are a lot of writing for the player. In order to get a really good sense of how a player is going to play a given thing, particularly when they're things that can be as ridiculously narratively overpowered as a superhero, you've got to get a lot of text from them, and it's difficult for some people. When you're using a system, you don't have to do that, because the system says, well, you can do these things. And even if you're not using the system in the sense of, I'm not going to go into the scene and roll the dice all the time, you can still say, well, I know I paid for this and I paid for this, so these are things that I can do pretty reasonably, and everyone can agree on that.
Well, and another thing is when you have people, when you're dealing with an established character, then people's perception of what something can do in their write-up is out of which books they've read, and they haven't necessarily read all of the books. But especially when you run into original characters, then somebody will write something, but unless they get really, really detailed and have more than anybody wants to read, where they stand is really kind of vague.
Yeah.
Oh, I would use the term subjective there, and that's what you read on the page at that point in time versus what it is you meant when you wrote it on the page at that point in time. So from what you guys are saying, we went with Fate as opposed to just a pure traits-based game because it gave us a baseline to work with.
Yeah, it gives everyone a shared headcanon, basically, or it goes a long way toward giving everyone a shared headcanon. Now, why did we use Fate as opposed to other RPGs? There are certainly other, they're called setting agnostic RPGs. They're RPGs that don't come with a world, essentially. So most RPGs out there that you can buy, pen and paper bookshops or online, they come with some sort of setting in mind, which is wonderful when you don't want to have to go through the work of building a setting. But there really aren't very many options to run, for example, Marvel. And there certainly aren't any options to do Marvel the way we're doing it.
Well, when you have comic book characters especially, you have such a vast difference in power scale between even very popular characters. When we're only working with Marvel, somebody like Magneto is far and away different from, even Spider-Man, no matter how much Spider-Man tends to win in the end.
Right. Well, you have your Captain Americas who are fundamentally humans on steroids. With some fancy kit and some training, you could make a decent argument, I think, for Captain America basically being Marvel's Batman in some ways, at least in terms of his physical ability. And then you have people like Wolverine, who you literally cannot kill.
No, that's Deadpool.
Oh yeah, that's Deadpool. Sorry, Wolverine.
And Deadpool, we don't allow Deadpool
to be angry. So there's that. We could have used something like Savage Worlds or GURPS, are the two very popular system agnostic RPGs that spring to mind. The problem is that only Fate is licensed in such a way that it is actually legal for me to hack it and then post everything on a website. Fate, and it's not actually a question of other game companies being, greedy or selfish or whatever you want to think about it. Most gaming licenses are very, very, very restrictive, and that's designed to protect people's intellectual property. Fate has been very generous, or Evil Hat, the company behind Fate, has been very generous in licensing their work through what's called the Creative Commons, and essentially the only thing we have to do to legally use their material is give them credit for having written it in the first place, which is something that we're more than happy to do. Now, is it especially likely to come up that some lawyer from either a game company or Marvel comes and says, "Hey, you're infringing on our copyright or our trademark or what have you, cease operations and take your game down"? No, that's not especially likely. But the fact that I might have to think about it at all is certainly a factor, and the fact that I really do want to be able to give people everything that they need to play the game up front, rather than saying, "Oh, hey, to go play this game, you need to go buy a copy of Savage Worlds," which they might not necessarily own, as opposed to a World of Darkness book, which your World of Darkness fans probably already do own.
Well, right. And another reason for Fate is we didn't want something crunchy.
No.
Which a lot of, like Champions or, some of the other superhero-based comics are.
There are two essential schools of RPG development. There's simulationist games, which are what gamers like to call crunchy. There's a lot of math involved, there's a lot of rules involved. There are things intended to represent things that would happen in a realistic or semi-realistic scenario. Most games are like that. It's only recently, probably in the last, if I had to guess, 10-ish years, that you've seen a movement towards games that are more designed to facilitate telling the story than they are to keep track of every single, pound that a hero can lift, or every single clip of ammunition that you're storing in your utility belt or what have you. We're not really interested in tracking that. We don't want to code systems to track that. I certainly don't want to write systems to track that. We just want a framework to tell a story.
Now, that's a really important distinction right there. One of the reasons we created the game was so people had a shared framework in which they could come and tell their stories. If they wanted a system to use, it's there if they want to use it, but they don't have to, do they?
No, absolutely not. I tend to not use anything, although I like some of the narrative ways Fate works, and so I try to draw on that, with the aspects where it's supposed to have this back and forth of you invoke it to use your aspect to do something cool, and you use compels to, which are kind of the flip side of it. So when I'm in a scene, it's like, well, this is one of her aspects. What, how could this drive how I act in the RP?
Right, which actually brings us to the third reason. The third question was just, what does Fate give you, period, by itself, not comparing it to anything else. And the thing that Fate gives me most of all is it behaves in ways that support telling a story. Now, it does require a shift in thinking from the people using it. You actually have to think of your actions in RP in terms of telling a story, which some people do naturally and some people prefer not to. Fate is very much designed to operate in terms of the ebb and flow of fortune. The twists in the story are modeled in the game systems, rather than things like how many pounds exactly can you lift. And those are things that I personally find valuable. If you don't want to use it, no, you don't have to. That's fine. But if you are going to use it, I like the way that it encourages collaborative storytelling.
Well, I'm not going to disagree. I'm going to admit straight up that I started my RP career experience, whatever you want to call it, a couple of years ago, and I started on a Fate system. And I look at other systems and I go, I have to learn this stuff. Whereas Fate, it was just a natural thing for me to pick up and work with. Now, I'm still learning it, but I've been able to learn it, and it's been a relatively shallow learning curve for me. Now, should people be worried if they don't know Fate coming to the game?
No, they shouldn't be worried for two reasons. The first is because of the aforementioned licensing things. I've actually provided, or we have actually provided, everything that you would need to play the game as if it were a tabletop game on the website. It's all there.
Well, and the way our CareGen's structured, I mean, it's like, okay, tell us about, your one sentence synopsis of your character, pick your skills, what you think you have them good at, and okay, build your power. Here's the stuff to pick from, what goes into that power.
Right. So we've taken a lot of we've even taken a lot of the required reading out of the equation. But beyond that is the fact that other than to siege in with, you really don't actually have to use fate for anything, which means that you don't have to know fate for anything. You go into your scene, your RP, and as long as everyone's having fun as staff, we really don't care what's going on beyond a few things which are posted as policies on our website. We don't even necessarily care if you're playing to your sheet. If nobody objects in the scene, then okay, superheroes do crazy things all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really telling point. We just want you guys to come along and have some fun and tell your stories. We've given you a system that if you want to use it, it's there. If you want to learn it, there are people that will talk to you about it and help you out as much as we can. We even run some tutorials for people. So if you're interested in learning more, come along, have a look. Jump in on one of our events and ask some questions. It's one of the easiest ways to get to learn about the system that we've put together. If you don't want to use the system, you don't have to. And that for me is just wonderful, because there are days I just want to just RP and tell a story, and that's exactly what I'll do.
Well, and there are some things that no tabletop RP system is good for on a mush. Combat is one of the things that comes to mind. Combat scenes in a tabletop are, in my experience, and my experience is rather extensive in these, long, drawn-out affairs. And that's with half a dozen people who can sit around the table eating snacks and flicking peanuts at one another while they talk about what's actually going on, and the DM, who has actually thought about this, explains everything. When you're doing it with complete strangers via a text chat on the internet, I've seen it work acceptably. I've never seen it work anywhere in any fashion that I would think of as well. So, even I, who love Fate, tend to sort of gloss over it when you get to things like combat, just because it slows everything down. It slows everything down to a point that I'm not entirely certain that everyone is having fun when it takes 25 minutes to figure out what a person's going to do and another 10 for them to pose.
Yeah. And I think you said it once to me, what you can probably get done in an hour in a tabletop game could take 3 to 4 hours on a mush to get through and do, simply because of the mechanics and the way it works.
Yeah, typing is a really big thing. Typing, editing, the arcane language that is a mush client, where it's not a WYSIWYG editor, so you have to put in your character turns. You have to put in, if you're doing anything fancy, you have to put that in. And even if you're not doing anything fancy, you're going to have to do a little bit to make sure you don't just give the other people this unreadable wall of text.
Yeah. All right, so we've just covered a couple of things there. We chose Fate because the licensing allows us to do it relatively easily. It's not a crunchy system. It facilitates storytelling. And I think the most important takeaway that I'd like people to take out of this is that you don't have to use the system if you don't want to. Even our CGen has been set up to walk you through it with minimal Fate knowledge.
That's about right, yes.
Okay, now did you want to add anything else there, Galactica or Reliant, before we move on to the next part of the topic, which is our technology?
No, I think I'm good.
So let's talk tech.
Let's talk tech, because tech in our environment's actually pretty cool. And I know that some people have asked me, like, well, does this exist still, or does this happen? And I had a scene once where someone posed that microfiche still existed, and then I got this page going, oh my goodness, do they still exist, or what does the tech here do? So let's talk about tech first. At the high level, we've got a couple of variations on it, or a couple of levels of tech. What are the important tech concepts that exist within our systems?
So obviously cloning is a really important thing to the setting, because that's how the population of Earth is being maybe rebuilt. One of the important things to know about cloning is that compared to a lot of other scenarios where you might see it, it's slow and it's expensive. Yes, you can vat grow a clone relatively quickly, but you're still probably talking something that's a project of at least a few years. And that's if you're like really cutting corners and using experimental techniques. Mostly like you actually clone someone and then wait for them to grow normally.
Well, and then something to be considered is, the people found the arcs, and the arcs had all of the did all of the legwork. Here's how cloning works, and they've had to back engineer into it.
Yeah, all of the cloning technology that everyone has is based off of the arcs. Now, it's been long enough that it's been iterated on probably a few times by people, but it all still comes from the same technological base. No one presently in the world actually knows what that is. They just know that these things existed. They had these banks of mutant genes and this cloning tech in it, and it's beyond anything that anyone had ever attempted, let alone actually built. Consequently, because it's been back engineered, it's not entirely understood either. So that's good for the players, because it means that the cloning processes sometimes do weird things for reasons that nobody really understands.
Okay, so it's expensive, it's slow, and I think something that we took out of our last episode is that the results aren't always guaranteed with the cloning technology either, are they?
Yeah, that's a function as much of us dealing with mutants as it is of the technology itself. It's not that the cloning tech is unreliable. You usually get a copy of whatever you put in there. But the way that Marvel wrote up mutants is that they tend to be basically people, human beings, until some sort of traumatic event triggers the awakening of their powers. Now, usually that happens in a lot of the classic stories in the teens somewhere, but sometimes it happens when they're very, very young. It's always pretty unpredictable, though, and I can't off the top of my head recall of very many comic instances where you're dealing with people who know what someone's powers will be before they manifest.
Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
It's no use asking me, because I'm like, comics, okay, sure. But anything I've read, no, they haven't known. What about the frameworks that go along with the cloning tech?
Frameworks are another. The full dive VR, full immersion VR stuff is another thing that was discovered essentially in the arcs. There were a number of clones already. There's a considerable backstock of clones in the arcs that hasn't been woken up because the process is so resource intensive and expensive, and partly because not everyone knows what they do, and they're a little afraid, understandably so. And
we do end up calling it the framework because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. had something similar, which we didn't actually see the episodes of until after we'd started our work on the background.
This is very true, and we kind of sat there and watched it and went, oh, wow, look at that.
So that's the big reason why it's called the framework versus, the Matrix, which is another, full dive VR thing that most people are aware of. But once again, that's something that was in the arcs. And of course, it's our vehicle to, you get to play the character you want with the background that you want to play. And it's been used by other people since.
Right, and you get to do it without breaking our world. Now, the trade-off, if you want to call it that, is that only the world as we have set it up is real. Everything else, you could be from someone who thinks they're from the Age of Apocalypse timeline or the House of M timeline, but it wouldn't be real. The character doesn't have to accept that. They can think it all actually happened, but from the perspective of the players, only the reality as we have postulated it is real.
Okay, and that then brings us to the brain scan tech that exists within our setting. And now that's been around for some time, but there's a couple of things around that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so the brain scan tech is based off of concepts that Marvel has done for a little bit. There's a recurring Captain America villain called Arnim Zola, who's basically a computer program, but was a person at one point.
Well, and then in the recent Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff, when they brought in all the LMDs, they copied the personalities of the originals to put into the LMDs. So
right. So the brain scan tech we have come up with does have some important limitations. The biggest one is that until very recently, it hasn't been possible to put a digitized brain into an organic body. The process just doesn't take. Brains aren't computers, basically, is what it boils down to. So we've gotten to the point where we can read them and we can scan them, but we haven't gotten to the point where we can write onto them reliably. It could happen, and of course, when you're dealing with player characters tend to be the exception to things and not the rules. But in terms of what you're likely to see out in the world with NPCs, if someone has had their brain scanned, they're probably an LMD or an AI.
Okay, now, before we go any further, LMD, because I know I get that question a lot. What's an LMD?
Yeah, so the life model decoy is actually something that's quite old in Marvel. They're
very old.
You can Google them. They've been around for a while. They're basically very, very, very realistic androids. Now, it is only recently, I think, that they've been the comics have been postulating life model decoys that are based on actual people. Prior to that, they were just sort of generic robotic spies.
We need to ask Rocinante, but I think that they actually have had them being other people for quite some time. I don't think it was quite as flawless. I'm pretty sure that that's how they explained how no, you didn't really kill Fury a few times.
I'm pretty certain that that's the case. I think I've had that conversation with Rossi a few times, actually. But an LMD is basically a really, really lifelike android. So lifelike that sometimes they forget or don't even realize that they're an LMD themselves.
They're also designed to pass medical scrutiny short of actually cutting them open.
Yeah, they're not reboot Cylons.
Reboot Cylons. Yeah, they're not that. Okay, so we've got the cloning, we've got the brain scan tech. What other important tech concepts exist, or are those the two main ones that we're focusing on?
Important to the setting, those are probably the main ones. One of the things about being set ahead of the traditional Marvel continuity, and also like way ahead of where we had sort of ended the traditional Marvel continuity for our world, is that the technologies and the scientific concepts that were sort of secret or exclusive to heroes back in the heyday of heroes in the 90s are much more well-known and well-understood, and in some cases, they're actually commercial products. So, for example, Stark Fujikawa sells repulsor lift flying cars. And repulsor lift technology has been out on the market long enough that most of the other mega corporations have created knockoff versions of it. It's just, there is powered armor that is used by the U.S. military in large numbers and corporate security forces in large numbers, which aren't things that you would have really seen outside some, super secret experimental unit back in the 90s.
Okay, so that's the general tech that we would sit here today and go, wow, that's really cool. It's kind of everyday stuff in our setting, is what you're saying.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's comics always exist sort of, even comics that are set in the quote unquote modern day are always exist sort of ahead of our own actual technological curve. And this is that taken is essentially a step beyond it. So the unusual has become usual. You've got Amazon succeeded in doing its delivery drone thing, and now a lot of things are delivered by delivery drones are just a thing. You've got robotic workforces that have replaced people for most of the menial labor. So your burger flippers, your janitors, and things of that nature.
Your self-driving cars.
You've got your self-driving cars, and pretty much most of the stuff that you could turn on any sort of near future movie from the 90s to the early 2000s, it's probably there.
Okay, now what you mentioned about the workforce, I it didn't actually dawn on me while we were starting to set this up, and once we got into it, I'm like, yeah, that would actually happen. With humanity dying out, there aren't enough people to do the work that needs to be done. So the robotic workforce, the AI type workforce, is actually really important to keep the world functioning, isn't it?
Yeah, and this gets sold in a couple of ways. It was certainly sold to the populace when it first came out as eliminating menial labor from people's lives and freeing them to fully realize their actual potential. And there is some of that at play. That because you don't want to have massive unemployment, the governments have invested fairly heavily into education and training for people. So most people, even who work at a low level, works in a supervisory capacity. They're supervising teams of robots, but they're still supervising. Or they work in very technical fields that you don't necessarily trust a robot to work in.
Or creatives.
Or the creatives, which robots can't do. Cough, can't cough.
And there's also the fact that if you want your PC to be a server or work in a cafe, yeah, go ahead and do it. No one's going to say you can't do it, but in general, that's what you're going to find when you're out on the streets of Chicago in our city.
No one's going to tell you you can't. I'm sure that there are hipster cafes where the workforce is all human because it gives a human touch, or the owners believe in whatever. But yeah, so if you want your character to be a waiter or a janitor or a secretary, yeah, that's fine. We're not going to tell you no. Just be aware that is unusual in the setting.
It would especially work if it is a cafe that specializes where you're not just bringing them the food, you're talking to them and having a social conversation and something like that. Or for a janitor, it might be for some very delicate stuff, or I don't know. I'm sure it's something.
I mean, if you can come up with something, that's great. We're not going to say no, you can't be that, because that doesn't work within our setting. We'll work with you to come up with something that does work. Now, can we talk a bit about weaponry? Because this is often where I trip myself up. I'm not a particular weapons person, and I look at things and go, I don't know what would exist. So, what sort of weaponry would we expect to see within our setting?
All right, so without going into really, really boring detail about this, basically what you're looking at is the stuff that is presently being looked at for next generation is the current generation of weaponry in our setting. So you're talking about magnetic accelerators, you're talking about directed energy weapons, which is a fancy way of saying like a laser or an ion weapon or something similar. You've finally gotten battery technology to a point that it's small enough and powerful enough that you can actually get away with stuff like this. And in some part that's thanks to fantasy comic technology like miniaturized arc reactors, which let you, in theory, pack large amounts of power to very small packages. So basically you're not looking at anything too sci-fi. This is not Heinlein's 50s sci-fi where every soldier has a nuke on their back. Mm-hmm. And this is not Star Trek where you can set your phasers to stun. But this is the kind of sort of near-ish future setting. You could call it Shadowrun-ish if you want, where, yeah, your really well-equipped characters might have a laser or an energy shield or, a 0-point reactor, hollow bow, or something that you might see in, say, Marvel 2099 tech that's kind of like that.
Awesome. And I just want to then move this forward a little bit to, we've mentioned wearables a few times in our scenes and in the RP. Wearables are kind of common day, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, as it is, everybody's kind of got their stuff wrapped up into their phone. So you've got a lot of people already looking at how can we integrate that so people don't have to carry around their phones all the time. And I'm sure that there's a lot of options. Some people have some implants done. Some people have, like bracelets or glasses or something to that effect.
Or watches, yeah. We're already seeing first generation wearables in real life. These are your Apple Watches and
mm-hmm.
Even the rather ill-fated Google Glass. And we're seeing them increasingly get paired with virtual assistants in the home, things like Amazon's Alexa or Google Home or Apple's Siri, whatever that is. And this is, again, that taken to the next step. So wearable technology is very common. Augmented reality interfaces are very common. It is not unreasonable for most people to expect that if something is being publicly projected in augmented reality, most people are going to be able to see it. I'm sure that's how a lot of advertising happens. That's how a lot of messaging happens. That's how you keep the text small, too, is you basically project whatever it's doing into virtual space that you don't actually have to have a huge screen or things of that nature.
Well, and, you know, with Iron Man and Iron Man's Jarvis and Friday and everything, that was the early precursors in, you know, the Marvel background to the Alexa and Series and stuff like this.
Right. Things that actually still exist today as home products. You can go buy Jarvis or Friday for your home, or Tony these days if
you're masochistic.
Yeah, if you want to virtually talk back to you all the time.
Now, something that's really grabbed my imagination is the holotech that exists. So it's not just the wearables, but for your science geeks or your geek geeks, the holotech is pretty amazing. If you want to look at your program or your code and how it's running, or you want to look at the biology of something, you can pull up your holotech and turn it around and flip it upside down and actually see it in a 3D space, in a relatively small space as well, correct?
Yeah, so for those of you who are familiar with the Iron Man movies, it is very much a case of you can bring up the schematics and wave your hands to make it blow up and disassemble itself and take a look at the individual pieces and call up the specs on something. There are two caveats on the holotech program. The first is there's a concept in Marvel, it's called hard light, which is basically Star Trek holograms. It's projected light that's physically solid. That's difficult to do, it's uncommon, it's bulky. The people who have it are usually the government and the military. The other thing is that holo projectors of any size are usually fairly sizable. You can carry around a holo projector with you, but the portable ones are usually going to give you a help me Obi-Wan Kenobi Princess Leia. They're not going to give you anything much bigger than that.
By the way, the original, you know, Iron Man, where he goes ahead and pulls up that schematic and it does the explode and everything. That was one of the coolest scenes I've ever seen.
You'd like to be able to do that with a schematic.
Tell me about it. I was watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 4, and you have Ada there, you know, doing her thing and zooming in and zooming out and moving things around. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Can I have that, please? So what else do people need to know about the tech in our world? Is there anything else? Computers still exist. We've got our AIs. What happens to the older tech?
Same thing that happens to the older tech today. It falls out of favor, but it doesn't really go away. And in parts of the world or even parts of the country that are less well supported by modern society, you definitely still find it. So your modern computers are all quantum computers, and they have been for some time. But you can find non-quantum computers all over. Just nobody uses them, and by nobody uses them, I mean nobody who has access to anything better uses them. There are still plenty of people who don't have access to anything better. Old chemical, old powder-based firearms, the stuff we think of as a gun today, that's still all over the world. You don't get rid of a weapon just because a better weapon came out, especially if you can't get the better weapon. So the old stuff is still out there. It's abandoned in a lot of cases, or it's being used by people who are sort of off society's radar. This is one of those things about society being very, very heavily urbanized. There aren't really people out in the countryside, and the people who are out there don't tend to have access to the stuff that everyone else has. Even the poor people in the huge urban sprawls have access to a certain level of technology that people who live by choice or by force out in the rural areas just won't have.
And from my perspective on that, once tech starts aging, yes, it's still available, but then you have your maintenance and your support issues for it. And that, for me, is a really good story driver. You could use an older powder-based weapon, but you might have some issues actually keeping it maintained or finding bits for it or finding the ammunition for it. microfiches. I used that as an example earlier on. Yes, they exist in a library, but who services them when they break?
Yeah, and where are the readers? Probably only in that library.
Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Gal?
Nope.
Alrighty, well, I'm actually really impressed, guys. We got through this really well today. Is there anything you want people to take away from today's podcast with them?
Mostly that the system isn't supposed to be very scary. It's really there to help you, and once you're through Siegen, you can kind of ignore it if you want to. And the setting is not supposed to be scary either. Like, if you have questions, feel free to ask us. Either we have an answer, or it's really not that important, and you can make something up. So,
I think that's the biggest thing is we're just looking for people to show up and play what they want, and if they'd like some help with something to make it easier for them along the way, we're glad to do that. But we don't want to police their RP. We don't want to tell them, no, you can't do that, or no, that's not how it is in the books, or no, that's not how our continuity went. That's why we try to have so much of the history vague. After this, nobody really knew about X, Y, and Z. That way you don't get told, well, that's wrong, because nobody really knows.
Excellent. So come along, have some fun. Don't let the system scare you. Don't let the settings scare you. And if you've got questions, we're here to help. I'm going to wrap this up then. Thank you so much, Reliant and Galactica, for coming and joining me today.
Mm-hmm.
And guys, if you have any questions at all, come and see us on the game or on our Discord channel. Drop us a note and we'll answer the questions as best we can. Until next time, this is Serenity signing off. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us at the Writer's Desk, the podcast for the Inheritance Gambit. If you've got any questions or anything you'd like to know about the game and why we put it together, please drop us a note via the website www.inheritancegambit.com.